The fourth night without sleep felt different from the others. It was not simply exhaustion that pressed against Queen Myra'ven's thoughts, but a slow, creeping unease that seemed to seep from the very walls of the palace. The corridors of Leora's orbital capital were never silent. There was always the distant hum of engines holding the city in its delicate balance above the violent storms of the gas giant. But tonight the sound felt louder, heavier, as if the machinery itself sensed something was wrong. She walked alone along a suspended passageway, her long ears catching every distant footstep, every whisper carried through the ventilation currents. Below the transparent floor, layers of the city shimmered in tiers of light, transit rings gliding in measured arcs, cargo drones drifting like schools of metallic fish, and far beneath, the faint glow of the lower districts where the lights were dimmer and the air less filtered. Cei'lin had always been curious about those districts. Too curious, Myra'ven had thought more than once. A palace guard approached from the far end of the corridor, clearly trying to walk with confidence, but managing something closer to an awkward shuffle. He saluted sharply, almost losing his balance in the process. "Your Majesty," he said, voice tight with fatigue. "Search teams Gamma and Delta report no findings. Thermal sweeps of the West Wing are complete." Myra'ven inclined her head. "Continue." The guard hesitated, then added, "One of the drones mistook a ceremonial statue for a life form again. It attempted to question it for 10 minutes before realizing the error." For a brief moment, the Queen closed her eyes. Was the statue cooperative? The guard blinked, unsure whether she was serious. Then, realizing she was, he allowed himself a faint smile. "Exceptionally, Your Majesty." When he had gone, the silence returned, but it no longer felt entirely suffocating. Even in crisis, absurdities persisted. Perhaps they always would. She resumed walking. Every surface of the palace gleamed with polished alloys and living crystal panels, their faint internal light pulsing like a slow heartbeat. Yet to Myra'ven, the beauty of it all felt hollow. Somewhere within this vast structure, her daughter had vanished without trace 4 days ago. No ransom, no signal, no demand, only absence. At first, the court had assumed a routine security breach, an error soon corrected. But the hours had passed, then the days, and the search had spread outward in widening circles. Surveillance records showed Cei'lin leaving her chambers shortly before dawn, wrapped in a plain cloak, moving through service corridors with deliberate caution. Then the recordings ended. Entire segments of data were simply missing. Not corrupted, not damaged. Removed. Myra'ven stopped before a tall observation window. Beyond it, the gas giant churned in vast bands of violet and silver, lightning flickering in storms large enough to swallow continents. Cei'lin had loved this view as a child. She used to press her hands against the glass and claim she could see shapes in the clouds. Cities, creatures, entire imaginary civilizations drifting in the currents. Once, when she was very young, she had insisted the storms were alive and merely pretending to be weather. Myra'ven exhaled slowly. The memory tightened something in her chest. Footsteps approached again, lighter this time. Commander Cei'lin emerged from a side corridor, his uniform slightly disheveled, as though he had forgotten to sleep as well. "We have expanded the search into the transit sectors," he said quietly. "No confirmed sightings." "And the lower districts?" Myra'ven asked. Cei'lin hesitated. "Teams are being organized. It is complicated to conduct a full sweep there without causing alarm." "Alarm is preferable to ignorance," she said. He inclined his head. "Yes, Your Majesty." They walked together in silence for several moments. At the far end of the corridor, a maintenance drone was attempting to polish a section of floor that was already spotless, its sensors whirring in mild confusion. It paused as they approached, emitted a polite chime, and moved aside with exaggerated courtesy. Cei'lin glanced at it and muttered, "I believe that unit has polished the same tile 17 times tonight." "Perhaps it finds comfort in certainty," Myra'ven replied. He allowed himself a faint huff of laughter, but the moment passed quickly, and the weight of the search returned. At last they reached the central operations chamber, where holographic displays hovered in layered constellations of light. Maps of the city rotated slowly, sectors blinking as teams reported in. Streams of data flowed like rivers across the air, each line representing a possibility, a hope, or another dead end. Myra'ven stood at the center of it all, watching the city turn in miniature before her. 4 days. 4 days since she had last heard her daughter's voice. She remembered their final conversation with painful clarity. Cei'lin had been restless, distracted, asking questions about security protocols and internal communications. Questions that, at the time, had seemed merely academic. Myra'ven had answered patiently, even teasing her for sounding like a strategist rather than a princess. Now she wondered what Cei'lin had truly been searching for. A technician approached cautiously. "Your Majesty, we have completed another analysis of the missing surveillance segments. And they were removed using high-level authorization codes." The chamber seemed to grow colder. "Whose codes?" Myra'ven asked. The technician swallowed. "We cannot determine that yet. Cannot or will not." The thought flickered through her mind but remained unspoken. If someone within the palace had helped Cei'lin disappear or forced her to flee, then the danger was far closer than any external threat. Myra'ven dismissed the technician and stepped back from the displays. Around her, officers continued their work, voices low, movements precise. The machinery of the palace functioned perfectly as it always had, and yet something within that perfect order had fractured. She turned toward the great doors of the chamber. "Prepare a transport," she said. Cei'lin looked up sharply. "Your Majesty? I am joining the search in the lower districts." There was a pause, heavy with unspoken objections. At last, Cei'lin said, "It may not be safe." Myra'ven met his gaze. "Nor is waiting." Minutes later, she stood on a landing platform as a small transport craft powered up, its engines humming with restrained energy. The night side of the city stretched beyond, layers of lights fading into darkness below. As the craft lifted and began its descent, Myra'ven watched the palace recede above her, its towers gleaming like distant stars. For the first time in 4 days, she felt something other than helplessness. Somewhere in the vast city beneath her, Cei'lin was alive. She felt it with a certainty she could not explain, and she intended to find her. The transport descended through layers of atmosphere that were not truly atmosphere at all, but controlled environmental strata, fields of filtered air, drifting traffic lanes, and shimmering shields that separated the ordered heights of the capital from the dense, sprawling districts below. From above, the lower levels looked like a scattered sea of lights, uneven and restless, nothing like the geometric precision of the palace. Myra'ven stood at the forward viewport, her hands resting lightly on the rail. The pilot, a young officer who had clearly never expected to carry the Queen herself, kept glancing back as if to confirm she was still there. "You may focus on flying," Myra'ven said without turning. "Yes, Your Majesty," the pilot replied quickly, turning back to his controls so fast he nearly clipped a passing cargo drone. The drone emitted an indignant chirp and flashed a warning icon before drifting away. Cei'lin, seated across from her, suppressed a smile. "The traffic drones have more confidence than some of our pilots." "Confidence," Myra'ven said, watching the endless structures rising below, "is often just ignorance wearing armor." The craft continued downward, passing between towers patched together from old station hulls, maintenance platforms, and structures that had clearly been built in stages over many years. Neon signs flickered in languages from half a dozen worlds. Small shuttles darted through narrow corridors of open space, guided by beacons that blinked in uneven patterns. When they landed on a modest platform, the air carried a faint metallic warmth and the distant scent of recycled water systems. It was not unpleasant, merely unfamiliar. A small escort of local security officers waited, visibly uncertain whether to kneel, salute, or simply stand still. One of them attempted all three at once, producing an awkward half-bow that nearly resulted in him stepping backward off the platform. A companion caught his sleeve just in time. Myra'ven inclined her head in acknowledgement and stepped forward. "You may walk normally," she said. "I have not come for ceremony." The officer exhaled with relief, so visible it might have been audible. They moved into the district on foot. The corridors here were narrower, the ceilings lower, and the lighting warmer, created by panels that glowed in soft amber rather than the cold white of palace illumination. People glanced up as they passed, Workers in stained utility suits, children chasing a hovering toy that resembled a luminous jellyfish, merchants adjusting stalls of spare circuitry and fabricated tools. Myra'ven felt the weight of their curiosity, but also something else. A quiet, cautious respect that did not come from fear of authority, but from recognition. A small child paused in the middle of the corridor, staring openly at her long ears. After a moment, the child whispered to his companion, not quite quietly enough, "I told you they were real." His friend whispered back, "I thought they were ceremonial." Myra'ven allowed herself the faintest smile as she passed. They reached a transit junction where a cluster of repair drones was attempting to recalibrate a malfunctioning grav lift. The lift rose abruptly, then dropped a few centimeters with a soft thud, then rose again in a jerky rhythm that resembled an uncertain dance. One of the drones emitted a frustrated beep. Cei'lin watched for a moment and said, "I believe it is losing an argument with its own stabilizers." "Then I wish it luck," Myra'ven replied, stepping carefully onto the lift when the drone signaled it was safe. The descent was smoother than expected, though the lift paused twice for no apparent reason. On the second pause, a recorded voice announced cheerfully, "Temporary inconvenience detected. Please enjoy the view." There was no view, only a maintenance wall less than a meter away. Cei'lin coughed quietly and Myra'ven found herself almost laughing. They emerged into a broader concourse lined with shelters and medical stations. Here the air was cooler, the lighting dimmer. Portable generators hummed softly, and the murmur of many voices blended into a low, constant sound. A local coordinator approached, bowing respectfully. "Your Majesty, we have begun checking all arrivals over the past 4 days. No confirmed match yet, but records here are incomplete." "Incomplete," Myra'ven repeated. The coordinator spread his hands helplessly. "Some systems are old. Some people prefer not to be recorded at all." Myra'ven understood. In the palace, every movement was tracked, every entry logged. Here, anonymity was sometimes the only form of freedom people possessed. They moved deeper into the shelter sector. Rows of narrow sleeping alcoves stretched along the walls, separated by thin partitions. Medical units stood at intervals, their diagnostic lights blinking in patient rhythms. A pair of technicians argued quietly over a portable scanner that insisted on diagnosing everything as a mild respiratory infection, including a crate of metal components. "It diagnosed my toolkit yesterday," one of them said. "Recommended rest and hydration." "Did you follow the advice?" the other asked. "I gave it water. It shorted out." Even Cei'lin allowed himself a quiet chuckle. But as they continued, Myra'ven felt a subtle tightening in her chest. Not fear exactly, but anticipation, as though some instinct guided her forward. She could not explain it, but she felt closer. At the far end of the concourse stood a smaller corridor, leading to a cluster of temporary medical rooms. A faint light glowed there, softer than the rest, and the air carried the sterile scent of antiseptics and cooling gel. Myra'ven slowed her steps. Cei'lin noticed. "Your Majesty?" She raised a hand slightly, signaling silence. Somewhere beyond that corridor, she felt it again. That quiet certainty, the same one that had come to her in the transport. Alive. She stepped forward, her footsteps almost soundless against the floor. The hum of equipment grew clearer, along with the soft murmur of a voice speaking gently, too low to distinguish the words. Myra'ven reached the doorway and paused, her hand resting lightly against the frame. For a moment, she did not move. Then very slowly she looked inside. The room was small, illuminated by a single panel that cast a steady, gentle glow across rows of compact medical units. The air carried the faint scent of sterilizing agents and the quiet, rhythmic pulse of monitoring equipment. Nothing in the space was grand or impressive, yet it felt calm in a way the palace never did, as if the walls themselves had learned to be patient. And there, on a narrow resting couch, lay Cei'lin. She was curled on her side beneath a thermal blanket, one hand loosely clutching the fabric as though afraid it might be taken from her. Her long ears rested against her hair, their slight tremor revealing that her sleep was not entirely peaceful. A faint band of healing gel glimmered along her temple, and beneath the edge of the blanket, Myra'ven could see the subtle rise and fall of her breathing. Steady, alive. Relief struck so suddenly that Myra'ven had to grip the doorframe to steady herself. For 4 days she had imagined every possible fate, every shadow of loss. Now all of that fear collapsed into a single overwhelming truth. Her daughter was here. Seated beside the couch was a human. He leaned back in a chair, one arm resting awkwardly on the edge of a diagnostic console. His head tilted slightly forward in the posture of someone who had meant to remain awake, but had surrendered to exhaustion. A datapad lay open on his lap. Its screen dimmed. One of his boots was unlaced, as if he had begun removing it and simply forgotten halfway through. For a long moment Myra'ven stood in silence, watching them. Cei'lin stirred faintly, shifting closer to the human side, her fingers tightening briefly in the fabric of his sleeve before relaxing again. The gesture was unconscious, the quiet instinct of someone who felt safe. Something unexpected moved in Myra'ven's chest. Not jealousy, not anger, but a complicated ache she could not immediately name. The human stirred. His eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then sharpening as he became aware of the figure standing in the doorway. For a fraction of a second he froze, clearly uncertain whether he was still dreaming. Then he straightened carefully, moving with exaggerated caution so as not to wake Cei'lin. He raised one hand, palm outward in a gentle, wordless request for silence. Myra'ven did not move. The human stood, stepping quietly toward her. Up close, she saw that he looked younger than she had first thought, though exhaustion had etched faint lines at the corners of his eyes. There was a calmness in his expression that surprised her, as if he were accustomed to working in the presence of urgency. "She's resting," he whispered softly. It took hours to get her to sleep without waking in panic. His voice was low, careful, respectful, without being submissive. Myra'ven studied him for a moment. "You know who she is," she said quietly. "Yes. And yet you did not report it." "No." The honesty of the answer hung in the air. "Why?" Myra'ven asked. The human glanced back at Cei'lin, then returned his gaze to the queen. "Because she was frightened," he said simply, "and injured. Whatever she was running from, she believed it was still looking for her." Myra'ven felt the words settle heavily in her thoughts. "I am Dr. Nathan Cross," he added after a moment, as if remembering courtesy belatedly. He hesitated, then gave an awkward half-bow that nearly caused him to bump his shoulder against a supply rack. A tray rattled softly, and he caught it just in time, wincing slightly. "I am aware of who I am," Myra'ven said. Nathan blinked, then allowed himself the faintest, sheepish smile. "Yes, of course, that was, poorly phrased." Despite everything, the corner of Myra'ven's mouth twitched. Behind them, one of the small medical units emitted a sudden, cheerful tone and displayed a blinking message. "Calibration complete. Have a healthy day." Nathan glanced at it. "That one congratulates itself after every adjustment," he murmured. "I haven't figured out how to stop it yet." The absurdity of the announcement, echoing faintly in the quiet room, seemed almost surreal. Myra'ven stepped closer to the couch. Up close, Cei'lin looked pale but peaceful. The tension that had marked her expression in recent weeks softened in sleep. A faint bruise marked her wrist, and there were other small injuries. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to tell a story of fear and haste. "She arrived 2 nights ago," Nathan said quietly. "Disoriented, exhausted. She wouldn't speak at first, only asked if she could stay somewhere no one would find her." Myra'ven closed her eyes briefly. "No one," she repeated. Nathan hesitated. Those were her words. Silence settled again, heavier now. At last Cei'lin stirred, her breathing shifting as she began to wake. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then sharpening as she saw the figure standing beside the couch. For a heartbeat she did not move. Then she sat up abruptly, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. "Mother?" The word was barely more than a breath. Myra'ven felt something inside her break and mend at the same time. She stepped forward, placing a hand gently on Cei'lin's shoulder. "You are safe," she said softly. Cei'lin's composure faltered, relief flooding her expression so quickly it was almost painful to see. She leaned forward, resting her forehead briefly against her mother's arm, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Nathan turned discreetly away, pretending to examine a monitor that clearly required no examination. After a time, Cei'lin drew back, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. I didn't know who I could trust, she said quietly. Myra'ven met her gaze. You can trust me. I know, Cei'lin whispered, but I wasn't sure who was watching you. The words fell into the room like a stone into still water. Nathan glanced up sharply. Myra'ven felt the chill of realization begin to spread through her thoughts. Outside, somewhere in the distant corridors, a maintenance drone collided gently with a wall and emitted an apologetic chirp, as if embarrassed by its own clumsiness. The small, ordinary sound seemed strangely loud in the silence that followed. For a long moment after Cei'lin spoke, no one moved. The quiet hum of the medical equipment seemed suddenly louder, each soft pulse of light marking the passing of seconds that felt heavier than they should have. Myra'ven studied her daughter carefully. Tell me, she said gently. Cei'lin hesitated, glancing briefly toward Nathan as if confirming that he would remain. He gave a small nod and quietly moved a chair closer, though he sat in it backward, resting his arms on the backrest in a posture that was both attentive and oddly informal. I began to notice small things, Cei'lin said at last. Records that had been altered, messages that arrived already marked as read, security rotations that changed without explanation. Myra'ven frowned. You should have reported this. I tried, Cei'lin said softly, but every time I prepared to speak, something happened. A conversation interrupted, a summons that never came, an advisor who insisted the matter was trivial, and then I realized, she swallowed, they weren't ignoring me. They were watching me. The words settled like frost in the air. Nathan shifted slightly. If someone had access to internal surveillance, it would be easy to monitor communications, he said carefully, especially if they held administrative authority. Myra'ven looked at him. You speak as though you have experience with such matters. Nathan gave a faint, crooked smile. Frontier colonies, he said. Small populations, limited resources, and occasionally very creative criminals. You learn to recognize patterns. Cei'lin leaned back against the couch, fatigue still visible in her movements. I found a fragment of data, she said, a routing log that showed security feeds being diverted. Not erased, redirected. To where? Myra'ven asked. I don't know. I copied what I could before someone accessed my terminal remotely. That was when I ran. Myra'ven's gaze sharpened. You fled the palace alone. I didn't know who else I could trust, Cei'lin said quietly. I thought if I stayed, I might disappear in a way no one would ever trace. The queen closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the weight of those words. When she opened them again, her expression had hardened, not with anger at her daughter, but with a cold, controlled resolve. We will find who did this, she said. Nathan cleared his throat softly. Before that, he said, you may want to consider something. Myra'ven turned toward him. If whoever is responsible believes the princess is still missing, that gives you time, Nathan said. But the moment they learn she's been found, they may act, Myra'ven finished. Nathan nodded. A small diagnostic unit beside the couch emitted a soft chime and displayed a scrolling message. Patient heart rate elevated. Would you like a calming audio program? Nathan glanced at it. No, he said quietly. The unit paused, then displayed, program canceled. Stay calm anyway. Cei'lin let out a weak but genuine laugh. It's very encouraging. It tries, Nathan said, sometimes too hard. The brief moment of humor eased the tension just enough for everyone to breathe again. Myra'ven studied Nathan more closely now. You have helped her, she said. You treated her injuries. You kept her hidden. Yes. You understood the risk. Yes. Why? Nathan leaned back slightly, considering the question as though it deserved an honest answer, rather than a convenient one. Because she needed help, he said at last, and because fear makes people do reckless things. I thought if she had time to rest, she might be able to think clearly again. Cei'lin looked at him, a faint smile touching her expression. He also threatened to sedate me if I tried to leave before my fever broke. Nathan spread his hands. In my defense, you were attempting to walk while barely conscious. I was not barely conscious, Cei'lin protested. You walked into a supply cabinet, Nathan said. There were poor lighting conditions. There were no lighting conditions, Nathan replied. The cabinet was glowing. Myra'ven felt an unexpected quiet warmth at the sound of her daughter's voice. Lighter now, touched with something resembling normalcy. But the warmth faded as the implications of the situation returned. "You cannot remain here," Myra'ven said to Cei'lin. "It is not safe." Cei'lin nodded slowly. "I know." Nathan stood, moving to a nearby console. "There's something else," he said, bringing up a small holographic display. "I analyzed the fragment of data she copied." Myra'ven stepped closer. Lines of code and routing diagrams hovered in the air, complex and shifting. "What do you see?" she asked. Nathan pointed to a cluster of nodes. "These pathways shouldn't exist. They're hidden channels, parallel routes inside the Palace network. Whoever created them wanted to move information without leaving a trace in the primary logs." "How many people would have access to create something like this?" Myra'ven asked. Nathan hesitated. "Very few." Silence fell again, heavier than before. From the corridor outside came the faint sound of voices, the distant rumble of carts, the ordinary life of the shelter continuing, unaware of the storm gathering at the center of the empire. Cei'lin looked between them. "What will we do?" Myra'ven straightened, the quiet authority of her presence filling the small room as surely as it did the grandest hall of the palace. "We return," she said, "but not openly, not yet. We move carefully and we trust no one without reason." Nathan folded his arms. "Then you may need someone who doesn't belong to the palace at all." Myra'ven met his gaze. For a moment neither of them spoke, but an understanding passed between them. Unspoken, reluctant, inevitable. Cei'lin broke the silence. "Mother," she said quietly, "I want him to come with us." Nathan blinked. "I'm not sure that's—" "You said yourself," Cei'lin interrupted gently, "that outsiders see patterns others miss." Nathan looked at Myra'ven, clearly expecting refusal. Instead, the queen studied him for a long moment, weighing possibilities, risks, and instincts she had learned never to ignore. At last she said, "Very well." Nathan exhaled slowly, as if only now realizing he had been holding his breath. "Then," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, "I suppose I should pack." He glanced around the small room, at the scattered instruments and half-finished reports. "Well," he added after a moment, "this may take less time than I expected." The preparations to leave the shelter were quiet, almost deliberately ordinary, as if keeping their movements small might prevent the larger dangers from noticing them. Nathan moved through the compact medical room, gathering a few essential instruments, pausing occasionally to decide whether an item was worth carrying or could be replaced elsewhere. He held up a portable scanner, considered it, then placed it in his bag. A moment later he took it out again, frowned at it thoughtfully, and set it back on the table. Cei'lin watched from the couch. "You've done that 3 times. It's a very indecisive scanner," Nathan said. "I don't want to pressure it." Despite everything, she smiled faintly. Myra'ven stood near the doorway, speaking quietly with Cei'lin through a secure communicator. The commander's voice carried faintly, outlining discrete routes and transport schedules. His tone calm, but edged with urgency. "We will avoid primary transit corridors," Cei'lin was saying. "If there is surveillance within the palace network, they may already be watching for unusual movements." "Understood," Myra'ven replied. "Prepare a craft in the auxiliary docks. No official records." She ended the transmission and turned back to the room. For a moment she simply watched her daughter, noting the steadiness returning to Cei'lin's posture, the clearer focus in her eyes. Relief was still there, but so was something else now. Resolve. Nathan finished sealing his bag and slung it over his shoulder. "I believe I am ready," he said. Then he looked around, hesitated, and picked up a small tool from the table. "Now I am ready." "What is that?" Cei'lin asked. "A calibration wrench." "Why do you need it?" "I don't," Nathan admitted, "but I've lost 3 of them this month, and I feel this one deserves a better fate." Cei'lin shook her head softly, amused despite herself. They stepped out into the corridor, where the low murmur of the shelter continued unchanged. People moved about their routines, unaware that a queen walked among them. A pair of technicians argued quietly over the correct alignment of a power relay, one insisting that the device was clearly tilted, the other insisting that the entire floor was tilted and the relay was innocent. Nathan paused to listen, then said, "For what it's worth, I think the floor is guilty." Both technicians turned to stare at him in mild confusion as he walked on. The corridor opened into the larger concourse. Myra'ven moved with quiet purpose, her senses alert to every movement, every sound. The farther they walked, the more she felt the invisible weight of the palace above them, the vast structure where decisions were made and secrets were buried. Cei'lin walked beside her in silence for a time, then said quietly, "I kept thinking you would be angry." "I am angry," Myra'ven said. Cei'lin looked down. "But not at you," the queen added gently. They continued in silence for several steps before Nathan spoke. "You mentioned copying a fragment of data," he said to Cei'lin. "Do you still have it?" She nodded and reached into the inner pocket of her cloak, producing a small crystalline storage shard no larger than a fingertip. It caught the light faintly, its internal structures glimmering with encoded patterns. Nathan accepted it carefully. "I'll need access to a more capable system to analyze this fully," he said. "But even the fragment suggests something complex. Whoever built those hidden channels understood the palace infrastructure extremely well." "Someone inside," Myra'ven said. "Yes." The word lingered heavily between them. They reached a narrow transit passage where a small cargo lift waited. The doors opened with a soft chime, revealing an interior barely large enough for the three of them and Cei'lin, who was already waiting inside. "Everything is prepared," Cei'lin said. His gaze flicked briefly to Nathan, measuring him with quiet curiosity, then returned to the queen. "The craft is ready." They descended in silence, the lift moving smoothly through layers of the structure. Through a narrow viewport, the city lights drifted past in slow motion, each level revealing new patterns of movement and life. At one point, the lift shuddered slightly, then resumed its descent. Nathan looked up at the ceiling. "That sound was either a minor mechanical fluctuation," he said, "or we have just been reclassified as cargo." Cei'lin stifled a laugh. The doors opened onto a dimly lit docking corridor. A small transport craft waited at the far end, its hull matte and unmarked, designed for discretion rather than display. As they approached, Myra'ven felt a subtle tightening in her thoughts. Not fear, but awareness. The next steps would lead them back into the heart of the palace, into the center of whatever web had driven her daughter to flee. Nathan paused beside the craft, glancing back toward the sheltered district behind them. "You know," he said quietly, "most of my patients complain about leaving here. The beds are uncomfortable, the food is questionable, and the heating system argues with itself. But it's peaceful." "Peace," Myra'ven said, "is often easier to find in places where no one believes power resides." Nathan considered that, then nodded slowly. They boarded the craft. The hatch sealed with a soft hiss, and the engines began to hum, low and steady. As the transport lifted into the vastness of the city, Cei'lin looked out through the viewport at the layers of lights receding beneath them. Somewhere within those countless structures lay the answers she had risked everything to uncover. And somewhere above, in the shining halls of the palace, waited the people who had tried to silence her. She drew a slow breath, steadying herself. This time she would not be alone. The transport rose through the layers of the city in silence, its engines tuned to a frequency designed to blend with the ambient noise of traffic lanes and service craft. From the viewport, the lower districts faded into scattered constellations of light, gradually giving way to the ordered geometry of the upper tiers. Towers grew taller, surfaces cleaner, the air lanes more strictly regulated. Cei'lin watched the change with quiet intensity. Only days earlier, she had fled downward through these same levels, moving in darkness and fear. Now she was returning, but the feeling was not relief. It was anticipation, sharp and steady. Nathan sat across from her, examining the crystalline shard under a small analysis lens clipped to his wrist. Lines of faint blue light traced across its surface as the device mapped the encoded structures within. "It's elegant," he murmured. Myra'ven looked at him. "Elegant?" "Yes," Nathan said. "Whoever built this routing system understood how to hide complexity inside simplicity. The channels aren't obvious. They're disguised as routine maintenance pathways." "That sounds less like elegance and more like treachery," Myra'ven said. Nathan gave a small shrug. Engineering and treachery sometimes share the same tools. Cei'lin, seated near the pilot's console, turned slightly. Can you identify where the channels lead? Not yet, Nathan said. But I suspect they converge somewhere centralized. Hidden systems usually do. The transport shifted course and, banking gently as it entered a restricted corridor marked only by faint navigation beacons. Beyond the viewport, the palace complex emerged, vast and luminous, its towers rising like frozen light against the dark curve of the gas giant below. Cei'lin felt a tightening in her chest at the sight. The palace had always seemed unshakable, eternal. Now she saw it differently, not as a sanctuary, but as a structure filled with unseen passages and hidden intentions. The craft settled into a shadowed docking bay far from the main traffic routes. The engines powered down, leaving only the faint ticking of cooling systems. Auxiliary Dock 7, Cei'lin said quietly. Only a handful of personnel know this bay exists. Nathan looked around as they disembarked. The docking chamber was vast but dim, lined with silent maintenance equipment and rows of inactive service drones. The air carried the faint scent of lubricants and recycled atmosphere. Well, Nathan said softly, it's less welcoming than the shelter. That is intentional, Myra'ven replied. They moved through a narrow service corridor that sloped upward into the deeper structure of the palace. Here the walls were unadorned, functional, the lighting subdued. It was a part of the palace few ever saw, the hidden arteries that kept the visible grandeur alive. Cei'lin walked close beside her mother. I used these passages once as a child, she said quietly. I was trying to prove I could reach the observatory without being seen. Did you succeed? Nathan asked. No, Cei'lin said. I got lost for 3 hours and was discovered by a cleaning unit that insisted on escorting me to the nearest authorized guardian. Nathan smiled faintly. Efficient. It lectured me about corridor safety the entire way, Cei'lin added. Cei'lin gave a quiet laugh. Those units take their duties very seriously. They reached a junction where multiple corridors branched in different directions. Myra'ven paused, considering the routes. We will not go directly to the central wing, she said. If there is surveillance in place, our movements will be noticed. Nathan nodded. We need access to a secure system first, somewhere isolated. Cei'lin gestured down a side corridor. There is an archival chamber nearby. Old infrastructure, rarely used but still functional. They proceeded in silence, their footsteps echoing softly. The farther they went, the older the structure became. Panels showed faint wear, and the lighting shifted to a warmer tone, less precise than the newer systems. At last they reached a heavy door marked with faded insignia. Cei'lin entered a code, and the door slid open with a low, reluctant sound. Inside, rows of ancient data cores stood in quiet ranks, their surfaces faintly glowing. The air was cooler here, dry and still, as if time itself moved more slowly in this place. Nathan approached a console, setting his bag down and inserting the crystalline shard into a reader port. The system hummed, its interface flickering as it struggled briefly to interpret the modern encryption. Come on, Nathan muttered. You're older than I am, but you're not obsolete. The console emitted a soft tone, and the display stabilized. There we are, Nathan said with quiet satisfaction. Lines of data began to unfold across the screen, branching pathways and routing patterns revealing themselves in intricate detail. Cei'lin leaned closer, her eyes scanning the structures she had glimpsed only in fragments before. Do you see it? She asked. Yes, Nathan said. The channels converge. Here. He highlighted a node deep within the palace network. Myra'ven felt a chill of recognition. The central administrative core. Cei'lin frowned. That area is restricted even to most of the council, which means whoever is responsible has access at the highest level, Nathan said. Silence settled over the chamber, heavy with implication. Cei'lin straightened slowly. Then we know where to look. Yes, Myra'ven said, but not yet how to act. Nathan leaned back from the console, rubbing his eyes. If I may offer one piece of advice, he said, it would be this. Do not confront them until you know exactly who them is. Myra'ven inclined her head. Agreed. At that moment, one of the older data cores emitted a sudden, cheerful chime, and displayed a message in large glowing letters. System optimization complete. Have a productive cycle. Nathan blinked at it. That's encouraging. Cei'lin raised an eyebrow. Encouraging? Yes, Nathan said. If the ancient equipment is optimistic, perhaps we should be as well. Cei'lin laughed softly, the sound echoing gently among the silent rows of machines. For a moment the tension eased, but beneath that fragile calm, they all felt the same truth. The path ahead was narrowing, and the heart of the conspiracy lay closer than ever. The chamber of the Central Administrative Corps was silent in a way that felt unnatural, as though the systems within it were listening rather than merely functioning. Myra'ven stood at the threshold, watching the faint light of thousands of data streams ripple across the circular walls. It had taken 2 days of quiet preparation to reach this point. 2 days of tracing hidden pathways, cross-checking logs, and quietly isolating the systems that had been manipulated. The evidence now rested in Nathan's portable console, a clear map of the secret channels and the identities of those who had authorized them. Cei'lin stood beside her, calmer now than she had been at any time since her return. The fear that had driven her into the lower districts had changed into something steadier: purpose. Are you ready? Myra'ven asked quietly. Cei'lin nodded. Cei'lin activated the door controls and they stepped inside. 3 figures were already there. Members of the inner council, their expressions composed but tense, stood near the central terminal. They had been summoned under the pretense of a systems briefing. Now as Myra'ven entered, realization began to dawn in their eyes. You know why I am here, the Queen said, her voice calm, but carrying through the chamber with unmistakable authority. One of the counselors straightened. Your Majesty, if this concerns the recent security irregularities, we were just concealing them, Myra'ven said. Nathan stepped forward, projecting the data into the air. Hidden routes, altered logs, and authorization signatures unfolded in a luminous web. There was no denying it. Silence followed, heavy and complete. At last, one of the counselors exhaled slowly. You cannot understand, he said. The Empire grows unstable. There are factions forming, threats you do not see. We created these channels to monitor them and to ensure continuity of power. By undermining your own throne? Myra'ven asked. By protecting it, Cei'lin spoke then, her voice steady. You threatened people. You erased records. You turned the palace into a place of fear. The counselor looked at her, his expression softening briefly. Princess, history is not written by the gentle. No, Cei'lin said quietly, but it is endured by them. For a moment no one moved, then Myra'ven signaled to Cei'lin. Palace security officers entered, silent and efficient, placing the counselors under arrest without resistance. The quiet click of restraint fields closing around their wrists seemed louder than any shout. When it was over, the chamber felt different, emptier but lighter, as though a pressure long contained had finally been released. Nathan exhaled slowly. Well, he said, that was less dramatic than I expected. Cei'lin glanced at him. Less dramatic? I had prepared several emergency escape plans, Nathan admitted. I am slightly disappointed not to use them. Cei'lin laughed softly, the sound echoing against the curved walls. Myra'ven looked at her daughter, and in that moment she understood how much had changed, not only in Cei'lin, but in herself. Once, she would have handled this crisis from a distance, trusting systems and advisors to act in her name. Now she knew how fragile such trust could be. Power, she realized, was not maintained by distance. It was maintained by presence. Later they stood together on one of the high observation balconies, the vast city of Leora glowing beneath them. Traffic lanes traced luminous patterns through the air, and far below, the lower districts shimmered like scattered stars. Cei'lin rested her hands on the railing. I used to think the palace was the whole world, she said, but it's only one part of it. Myra'ven nodded, and sometimes the most important truths are found far from where we expect. Nathan leaned against the railing a short distance away, looking out over the lights. You know, he said, I should probably return to the shelter at some point. I suspect my patients are telling the scanners terrible things about me in my absence. They will survive, Cei'lin said. Yes, Nathan agreed, but the scanners may not. They stood in comfortable silence for a time. the cool air of the upper levels moving gently around them. At last Myra'ven spoke. "Dr. Cross," Nathan turned. "Yes, Your Majesty?" "You offered sanctuary when I could not. For that you have my gratitude and my trust." Nathan inclined his head, clearly uncertain how to respond. "I only did what anyone should do." "Not everyone does," Myra'ven said. The gas giant turned slowly beyond the horizon, its vast storms glowing faintly in the reflected light of the city. Watching it, Myra'ven felt a sense of stillness she had not known in many days. The danger had passed. The truth had been uncovered. And though the Empire would always face new challenges, she knew now that strength was not found only in command halls and fleets, but in the quiet courage of individuals, in a frightened princess who chose to run rather than be silenced, and in a tired human medic who offered safety without asking for titles. Beside her, Cei'lin smiled faintly, her long ears stirring in the gentle wind as she watched the lights of the city below. For the first time since the search had begun, the future no longer felt uncertain. It felt open,